Kansas gives landlords broad freedom to set and raise rent within a well-organized statutory framework. The governing law is found in the Kansas Residential Landlord and Tenant Act, Kansas Statutes, Chapter 58, Article 25. And while it doesn't restrict the amount a landlord can charge, it establishes clear procedural requirements that landlords must follow. Kansas does not have rent control or rent stabilization of any kind. There is no state statute that caps rent increases, limits the frequency of increases, or requires landlords to obtain government approval before raising rent. Kansas's political and regulatory environment strongly favors property rights and market-based pricing. Kansas has enacted a preemption statute that prevents local governments from enacting rent control. Under Section 12-16119, no city or county in Kansas can adopt any ordinance, resolution, or regulation that would impose rent control on private residential property. This means Wichita, Kansas City, Topeka, Lawrence, Overland Park, and every other Kansas municipality are legally barred from implementing rent caps. The preemption gives Kansas landlords certainty that the market-based framework is uniform across the entire state. For month-to-month tenancies, the landlord must provide advance written notice before a rent increase takes effect. Kansas requires at least 30 days written notice before the next periodic rental date for changes to the terms of a monthly tenancy. So if rent is due on the 1st and you want the increase to take effect on May 1st, you need to deliver the notice by April 1st at the latest. The notice should be in writing and should clearly state the current rent, the new rent amount, and the effective date. Kansas doesn't prescribe a specific statutory form for rent increase notices, but a clear written notice delivered by a documented method, personal delivery, certified mail, or other verifiable means, is always recommended. For fixed-term leases, the rent is locked in for the duration of the lease term, unless the lease includes a provision allowing midterm increases. Common midterm adjustment provisions include escalation clauses, provisions tied to property tax changes, and CPI-based formulas. Without such a provision, the landlord must wait until the lease expires to negotiate a new rent as part of a renewal or new lease. When a fixed-term lease approaches expiration, the landlord should communicate the proposed new rent well in advance. If the tenant agrees, a new lease or renewal is executed at the new rate. If the tenant doesn't agree, the lease expires at its natural end. If the tenant stays and the landlord accepts rent, the tenancy converts to a month-to-month arrangement, subject to the 30-day notice requirement. For week-to-week tenancies, the notice period for rent changes is 7 days, matching the one rental period standard. Now let's cover the restrictions that apply even without rent control. Rent increases cannot be retaliatory. Kansas has a specific anti-retaliation provision under Section 58-2572 that prohibits landlords from raising rent in retaliation for a tenant exercising their legal rights. Protected activities include making a good faith complaint to a government agency about a code violation, complaining to the landlord about conditions that violate the rental agreement or applicable building or housing codes, exercising any right under the Residential Landlord and Tenant Act, and participating in a tenants organization. Kansas's anti-retaliation statute creates a rebuttable presumption of retaliation if the landlord takes adverse action within 6 months of the tenant's protected activity. 6 months is a meaningful protection window. Any rent increase delivered within that period after a tenant's complaint carries an automatic inference of retaliatory motive. The landlord must then demonstrate that the increase was motivated by legitimate business reasons unrelated to the tenant's complaint. If a landlord is found to have engaged in retaliatory conduct, the tenant can recover up to 1.5 months' rent in damages plus attorney's fees. The finding can also undermine the landlord's credibility in any related legal proceedings. The 6-month presumption means landlords need to be particularly careful about the timing of rent increases relative to tenant complaints. Rent increases also cannot be discriminatory. Under the Federal Fair Housing Act and the Kansas Act Against Discrimination, found in KSA Chapter 44, Article 10, landlords cannot raise rent based on a tenant's race, color, religion, national origin, sex, disability, or familial status. The Kansas Human Rights Commission investigates fair housing complaints and can take enforcement action including ordering damages, injunctive relief, and civil penalties. Some Kansas cities have enacted local anti-discrimination ordinances that provide broader protections. Lawrence, home to the University of Kansas, has enacted protections that include sexual orientation and gender identity. Other Kansas communities may have similar local provisions. Landlords should verify the specific anti-discrimination categories that apply in each jurisdiction where they own property. From a practical standpoint, Kansas's rental market is diverse, with several distinct metropolitan areas and secondary markets. The Kansas City metropolitan area, which straddles the Kansas-Missouri border, is the largest rental market in the state on the Kansas side. Overland Park, Olathe, Shawnee, Lenexa, and Kansas City, Kansas together form a substantial suburban rental market driven by proximity to the broader Kansas City economic engine. The Johnson County suburbs, in particular, have strong rental demand driven by excellent schools, corporate employment, and family-friendly communities. Rents in Johnson County are among the highest in the state, and landlords generally have strong pricing power. Kansas City, Kansas, in Wyandotte County, has a more diverse market with a range of price points. The area around the Kansas Speedway and Village West development has attracted investment, but other parts of KCK remain more affordable with more moderate pricing power. Wichita, Kansas's largest city, has a rental market driven by the aviation industry, including Spirit Aerosystems, Textron Aviation, and Bombardier Learjet, healthcare, higher education, and regional commerce. Wichita's rental market is affordable by national standards and offers moderate pricing power. The aviation industry's cyclical nature can affect employment levels and rental demand, so landlords in Wichita should monitor the aerospace sector's health when planning rent increases. Topeka, the state capital, has a stable rental market driven by state government, healthcare, including Stormont Vale Health, and regional services. Rents are affordable, and increases tend to be conservative. The Washburn University area has a student-influenced submarket. Lawrence, home to the University of Kansas, has a tight rental market heavily influenced by the university. Student housing demand is strong, and rents near campus are higher than what the city's size might suggest. Rent adjustments in the student market typically occur at the beginning of each academic year. The broader Lawrence market also benefits from the university's economic impact and a growing technology sector. Manhattan, home to Kansas State University and Fort Riley, has a rental market influenced by both the university and the military. The dual demand drivers create a relatively strong market for a small city. Military tenants' housing budgets are tied to BAH rates, and landlords near Fort Riley should monitor annual BAH adjustments when planning increases. Student housing near K-State follows the academic calendar. Fort Leavenworth, home to the U.S. Army Combined Arms Center and the Command and General Staff College, generates military rental demand in the Leavenworth area. The installation attracts mid-career officers from around the military, creating demand for quality rental housing. BAH considerations apply here as well. McConnell Air Force Base near Wichita creates military rental demand in the surrounding communities. Landlords near McConnell should monitor BAH rates and understand that the military population represents a reliable but budget-constrained tenant base. Hayes, Emporia, Pittsburgh, and other smaller Kansas cities have rental markets influenced by regional universities and local employers. These markets are more limited in size and pricing power, and landlords need to be conservative about increases to maintain occupancy. Rural Kansas, including the agricultural communities across the western and central parts of the state, has the softest rental markets. Population decline in many rural Kansas counties has reduced demand, and landlords in these areas have minimal pricing power. Some western Kansas communities have seen demand fluctuations tied to meatpacking plants and other agricultural processing facilities that employ significant workforces, including immigrant and refugee populations. But overall, rural Kansas rental markets require conservative pricing strategies. One best practice for Kansas landlords, given the 6-month anti-retaliation presumption, establish a consistent schedule for rent increases across all your properties. If you implement increases at the same time each year, such as at lease renewal, the pattern demonstrates that increases are routine business decisions rather than reactions to individual tenants' behavior. Keep detailed records of market comparables, operating cost changes, and property improvements that support each increase. Another best practice, for landlords in university towns like Lawrence and Manhattan, understand the student housing cycle and competitive landscape. The student rental market turns over annually, providing a natural opportunity to adjust rent. But competition from purpose-built student housing, fraternity and sorority housing, and other providers can be intense. Pricing must reflect the specific competitive dynamics of the student market, including amenity packages, proximity to campus, and the quality of the living experience. For landlords in the Kansas City suburbs, track both the Kansas and Missouri side markets when setting rents. Many tenants choose between living in Kansas or Missouri based on total cost of living, including rent, taxes, and commute, and your pricing should be competitive within the broader metro context. Kansas's lack of local income tax in most jurisdictions is a competitive advantage that can support somewhat higher rents compared to the Missouri side. Kansas also has specific requirements for manufactured home community lot rents under the Kansas Manufactured Housing Act. Landlords who own or manage manufactured home parks must follow specific notice and procedural requirements for lot rent increases that differ from standard residential tenancies. For Kansas landlords who participate in the Housing Choice Voucher Program, rent increases must be approved by the local housing authority. The authority evaluates whether the proposed rent is reasonable by comparing it to comparable unassisted units. Submit increase requests well in advance of the desired effective date. Kansas requires landlords to return the security deposit within 30 days of the tenant vacating. Kansas limits the security deposit to 1 month's rent for unfurnished units and 1.5 months' rent for furnished units. If the landlord fails to return the deposit within 30 days, they may be liable for 1.5 times the amount wrongfully withheld. While these rules don't directly regulate rent increases, landlords should understand that increasing rent doesn't automatically entitle them to collect additional deposit from an existing tenant. The cap is based on the rent at the time the deposit was collected. For the complete guide to Kansas rent increase laws, visit tenantscreeningbackgroundcheck.com. Subscribe to our channel for every state in our landlord-tenant law series.